Welcome to the February 4th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham and I'm joined by MC Bredner, who is the producer of the show. Yeah, wave to the crowd, MC. This is a very interesting show that we've got because no sooner were we finished doing yesterday's show, which was about Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico, than the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, negotiated an agreement with him. So there's a pause on that for 30 days on implementing the tariffs, and in return, apparently Canada had already committed $1.3 billion to beefing up border security. So Trump agreed to that as part of the deal, and then there has to be a fentanyl czar. No idea. I don't think anybody knows what that person will actually do. There's a fentanyl czar, and there's a couple of other minor, but it's sort of parts to the agreement. But you can't help but look at that and think that Trump just rolled over.
Yeah, I mean it's a little bizarre, I think, and I guess we'll have to see how this implementation goes and what's going to happen at the end of the 30 days.
Well, yesterday we talked about his America First trade policy memo, which very few people have read, and I happened to stumble across an article by Deborah Elms of the Heinrich Foundation, who had read it and wrote about what's in it, and Trump really has big plans to change global trade patterns, trading rules, and to the advantage of the United States. Well, if this is how he's going to handle every one of those changes, I feel a lot more. I'm kind of relieved, but I suspect that's not going to be the case. Everybody in Canada should be on the edge of their seat until 30 days from now to see what's going to come. The other story that we wanted to talk about just before we get into the main topic of this episode, which is the Canadian carbon tax that's
Yeah,
generated a lot of
absolutely.
yeah, a lot of controversy in Canada, and we're going to break it down and show you where emissions come from and what some of the options are. But I wanted to talk about an article I saw in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. oil companies tell Trump they're not interested in boosting output of oil. So you remember he came in and drill baby
Yeah.
drill, and he was going to, his stated intent was to get the United States to boost its oil production. It's already the biggest oil producer in the world, 13.2 million barrels of oil a day, but he wanted more. Energy dominance, he said. So after all of that, the CEOs of the companies went to him and said, "Yeah, we're not doing that. Why would we do that? That's not in our best interest. All we'll do is drive down prices and
Yeah.
drive up our costs because we'll have to have more rigs and labor will be in short. All of that stuff. So this has not been a good couple of days for President Donald Trump. I have to say, nobody is surprised by this, but still, I was a little. It was interesting to see the oil industry push back like that.
Yeah, it's just evidence that he doesn't really understand the industry as a whole. He's just cherry picking certain little issues that he wants to address, but doesn't really understand the big picture.
That's a little scary. The guy's the president of the United States, and it's not just him. You'd think that he'd surround himself with people who know what's going on, because you're not supposed to screw it up that bad. But whatever. Okay, let's move on to the next piece. Now we have, because this is the way we do things at the Energy Show, we have data for you. So if you want to pull that PowerPoint up, MC, let's get into the data, and we're going to talk about emissions in Canada, how much they are, where they're from. So let's start out, and all of this data was taken from it's the Environment and uh, uh, Climate Change. ECCC is the department's, ECCC is the department's name. And that's where this data comes from. It's official data. So first of all, you can see that the uh, national emissions peaked about 2007 at 777 megatons uh, per year. and now have fallen to about 708. So we've made some progress. Canada's a big emitter per capita, one of the biggest in the world. And this is so we wound up, we brought it down a little bit, and let's have a look at the next slide. Now this is interesting because if you break it down by province, the thing that really sticks out is the fact that Alberta, with only 12.5% of the population, far, far away, almost, I think it's like 38% of all of Canada's national emissions come from Alberta. But right next door, on to the left on the screen is Saskatchewan, which is 12%. So the two provinces that make up 15% of the population are 50% of all emissions. And this will come up, this will be important because when we get discussing the federal government's plans for the carbon tax. And for those of you who don't know, it's a Liberal government in right now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is stepping down. There's a leadership race on. Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor, is the leading candidate, I would say. Chrystia Freeland, the former finance minister, is kind of number two. Let's say they're running neck and neck, for sake of argument. But the point here is they have said that both of them have committed to axing the consumer carbon tax. And when you start breaking it down, you begin to see where the problems are. And so the two biggest problems, far and away, are Saskatchewan and Alberta. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is interesting. This is those same emissions broken down by sector. And what you see is oil and gas, no surprise, is the biggest one. It's about 26% of emissions. Transport is the next one at about 24, 25%, if I'm not mistaken. And then after that, buildings, electricity, heavy industry, agriculture really are, kind of in the 5 to 10% range. And then waste and others is quite a bit smaller. So if you were a policymaker looking at this, and you wanted to get emissions down so that Canada could meet its commitments under the Paris Agreement, you would think that you would target transportation and oil and gas. That's your low-hanging fruit. That's where your biggest problem and where you need to make changes right away. So next slide, please. So let's look at the oil sector. And here, this is at the national level because there's also, in addition, Alberta's, about 80% of Canadian oil production. But there are other provinces. Saskatchewan has got a fair amount, and Newfoundland and Labrador and Manitoba a little bit. And those are kind of the four oil-producing provinces. So in Alberta, which makes about 4 million barrels a day, natural gas is a big contributor. The conventional side is a much smaller contributor. It produces about 500,000 barrels a day. And then you have the oil sands, and it's the big kahuna in terms of producing emissions. And the emissions intensity per barrel has fallen over time. It used to be, about 2009, I think it was 83 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel, and now it stands at about 66. So they have made some improvements in bringing down the emissions per barrel. The problem is if you produce more barrels, then the extra emissions you created by doing that overwhelm the savings that you got from reducing the emissions intensity. And that's where Alberta finds itself. And the Premier Danielle Smith and the Energy Minister Brian Jean are forever talking about Alberta's falling oil emission, greenhouse gas emissions, and really what they mean. It's kind of dishonest in my view, because the absolute emissions are either rising or plateaued, and it's only the emissions intensity that are falling. But it's the absolute ones that count when it comes to the Paris Agreement and contribution to climate change. If we could get the next one, please. Now, this is total Alberta greenhouse gas emissions. I guess now that I think about it, we touched on that, but in the first graph. But I wanted to show you this one, at how it's risen up until about 2012, 10, 15 years ago. And then it started to come down a little bit, plateaued, came down again during the pandemic, seems to have plateaued by now. And this is after I wouldn't say that Alberta was the most strenuous province in terms of reducing emissions, but there's been a lot of talk about reducing emissions, and companies, various companies are putting in place policies to do that, but not making a lot of progress. Well, let's take a look at the next slide. So this is total Alberta oil and gas emissions, and what do we see? Oil sands, both of the mining and the SAGD sides, steam assisted gravity drainage, that's far and away the biggest one, and it's at 84 kilograms per barrel, and it's been going up steadily. If we showed you a graph of those emissions, they keep going up 2 or 3 to 4 every year. Now there's talk about maybe now they're going to plateau. Personally, I'm skeptical because they keep adding more and more production. And it's slow, as we said before, your emissions intensity can come down, but if you produce too much more, then your absolute emissions go up. And I suspect that that's what we're going to see in the next little while. This number 2 on here is natural gas production and processing. And basically, it's fugitive methane emissions. And there's 2 problems. Well, there's a number of problems here, but one of them is measurement because the data is way underestimated. More recent studies have shown that these numbers are probably 1.5 to 2 times too low. They should be higher. So we're just getting to the point where we're getting different, better measurement techniques of satellite sniffers, where once a year they used to go out with a little handheld gun and measure the emissions, which is really inadequate. Now they have on-site remote sensing all the time. I mean, there's all kinds of changes coming to the industry, but it takes time to roll that technology out, change people's behavior, and so on. So this one, though, is the low-hanging fruit because it's stuff leaking out of equipment. It's methane emissions leaking out of equipment, leaking out of the well, leaking out of the pipelines. Those are the kinds of things that you can fix. And all the provinces that agreed to reduce their methane emissions by 45% by 2030. Alberta last year came out and said that it had already achieved that goal and said, we're not going to do any more. That's what Danielle Smith said. We're not spending any more money to we've already hit our target. That's all we need to do. The problem here is that the rest of the industry is having trouble. So lowering emissions. So the criticism is, well, look, if this is your low-hanging fruit, if this is the easiest and lowest cost emission to abate, why not put more resources into that? Get that cleaned up first, and then we'll start working on these other things like the oil sands, which is a much tougher, it's more difficult to lower emissions there. And there's another issue in that I'm not sure that 45% is accurate. Now, the premier, in fairness to her, she got it from the Alberta Energy Regulator. You can find if you hunt around their poorly organized website, you can find it because I did. And the data is right there for you. The problem is the national inventory report for this shows at best 33%. And I've asked economists, why is there a discrepancy? And whose numbers do we use? Well, we don't have answers to that. And we're probably going to fight about it. And we'll never have answers to it. But the issue here is natural gas is a big problem, and it is the easiest to fix because we have the technology, we have the equipment, it's cost effective, and every molecule of gas that you save is a molecule you can sell. So that's a big advantage for producers. All right, if you could get out of the PowerPoint, please. Now we're going to talk about carbon tax and show you how some of the data that you just saw makes sense. So how does a carbon tax work? Now, I'm not an economist. If you ever heard me talk about economics, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. But here's how I understand it. So let's say that I want to reduce emissions at the consumer level. And so what I do is I put it on a carbon tax, which is now $85 per ton. And I increase the cost of goods that you buy, like gasoline and natural gas to heat your home, I I make it more expensive for you. And so
Mm.
at some point, when it becomes more expensive, then consumers look at that and go, man, I wonder if there's any alternatives to this. And of course there are.
Right. Hmm.
You and your husband just bought a an EV, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how inexpensive is it to operate?
Oh, I mean, it is a little bit more expensive to buy, of course, your capital expense, but once you have it, it's nothing compared to gas. I mean, you're looking at 20% what you would pay to fill it up if you were using gas.
And I'm assuming that you probably charge it up at home.
Yeah, we do. Most of the time. I off When you go on longer trips, you really have no choice, and it is a little more expensive to charge it outside of your house. Probably about double to triple what you pay at home, but at home it's like, $5, $7 per charge.
That's, I had to fill up my little SUV. It's really a little station wagon, but it's classified as an SUV. Anyway, it cost me, 110, $115. So I
Yeah.
envy you. And it's about this, it's actually a little smaller than your EV. And it cost me that much. So there's the advantage. So now once you raise the cost of gas or price of gasoline high enough, consumers like you and I will look at that and go, well, maybe the economics favor the electric vehicle. And then you start
Right.
looking at it and you find,
Mhm.
oh, I like the acceleration and it's got more room inside because you don't have the transmission hump and on and on and on. And then that now you're going to buy an electric vehicle.
Mhm.
But because this is not a revenue generating program, it's a it's intended to send consumers like you and I a price signal. It's to change
Right.
your behavior. So I don't
Mhm.
want to, if I'm the policymaker, I don't want to take your money into general revenue and spend it. I want to give it back to you in a rebate. And so
Right.
the Canadian program has a rebate built into it. And the data show that about 80% of Canadians get more back from the rebate than they paid. And the 20 that don't would be higher income Canadians for presumably it's not as big of an issue.
Right.
So that's how the tax works in the real world. And economists have been pushing this really hard because it is the most elegant, efficient, and effective way to bring down emissions because it's market based. That's the
Yeah.
thing. It's so, uh, but, but there's a problem. And I had an interview with Danny Cullenword, who is a professor at Stanford. And back in 2021, he and a colleague wrote a book on climate policy, and they talked about a lot about carbon pricing. And there are difficulties with it. So let's hear what Professor Cullenword has to say.
Neither myself nor my co-author David Victor from UC San Diego, we're not opposed to market-based policies, and we think they can play important roles. We just think if you look really carefully at how they work and how they've operated, that role is a lot smaller than basically all of the discourse around this policy instrument has suggested it should be or could be. So it's a bit of a nuanced argument in the sense that we're not saying take a sledgehammer to all of these policies, but we do think that they've been overhyped and that understanding their practical limitations is a key part of getting the response to climate change right.
Okay, isn't that interesting? Now, you have to build a political constituency for this program. Every policy has to be supported
Absolutely.
by the voters. And what
Hmm.
happened initially, this one was, I think it was done pretty well at the introduction. And then things went off the rails, as they often do. And the federal liberals just frankly, their heart was in the right place, but their head was not. Their communications around this program was terrible. I mean, people
Yes,
would,
absolutely.
yeah, the rebate would show up in your bank account and you wouldn't know that it was the carbon tax rebate. It wasn't
Yeah.
labeled properly. I mean, that probably happened to you and your family lives in Ontario. I bet there's been
Yeah.
conversations about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, it's just in general, it wasn't explained very well, and then also it is kind of hard for people to understand why they would be getting back more than they put in, and just, I mean, when you try to really put it in simple terms, it doesn't make a lot of sense to, the average Canadian.
The objections to it are, how can you tax emissions down? That'd be,
Yes,
and if you're taxing me, why are you giving it back to me? Like that makes no
exactly.
sense. I mean, even if you gave me back exactly what I was taxed, in the consumer's mind, that doesn't compute. And the communication from the government didn't clear it up at all. So
No.
anyway, there's been a lot of growing opposition, and then last year, the Canadian Conservative Party, which is the official opposition at the federal government at the federal level, launched its Axe the Tax campaign, and very quickly it solidified into it was significant opposition to
Yeah.
the carbon tax, and it was nasty because my MP Gord
Yeah.
Johns had an axe thrown through the plate glass window of his office, which
Mm.
is terrifying for staff, and you never know what's coming. So it's got to the point now where the political legitimacy of the carbon tax is erased. It doesn't have
Yeah.
it. And so the
Um,
the CPC says it'll get rid of it. The NDP, the New Democratic Party, which is the third party in Parliament, says it will get rid of it. And the two leading contenders, Carney and Freeland, also say that they'll get rid of it. Now, we should make a point here. This is important. There are actually two components to it. There's the consumer carbon tax,
right.
what we're talking about here. Then there's the industrial emitters carbon tax. And those are
Hmm.
designed by the provinces. Alberta has one. It's called TIER, T-I-E-R, and there's an equivalency agreement with Ottawa, and that's how it gets administered down at the provincial level. So what they're proposing is, and this is ironic because the Liberal leadership hopefuls are basically proposing exactly what the CPC did in the last couple of elections. Get rid of the consumer part of it, keep the industrial emitters tax,
Right.
which is kind of hilarious. Now, let's talk about Carney. So Carney, he's an economist, and he's operated at the global level. He's a leading voice and organizer for uh, uh, finance into the transition. He's worked Bank of England, Bank of Canada. He's worked in private sector. BlackRock Assets is where he was up until lately. So Carney is a very well-known figure in the finance field, and so
Absolutely.
what he's doing is he says, okay, we're not going to have the consumer tax. We're going to move to incentives. We're going to move to incentives.
Yeah.
And we're going to provide incentives for energy efficient buildings. Now, th there's some validity to this. Our furnace quit about almost 3 years ago now, so we had to replace it. And we replaced it with a heat pump, which was about, by the time all the dust settled, was about $18,000, whereas a natural gas fireplace, high efficiency with air conditioning, would have been about $10,000 installed,
Yeah.
something like that. But the incentives provided by the Green Home Plan at the federal level and by the British Columbia government and BC Hydro is effectively made the two the same cost. And I
Hmm.
have to tell you, it is heat pumps are amazing. I love them, and the cost now, the addition to my electric bill is almost negligible. It's
Wow.
I have in the summertime, my bills average between 70 and $100. That's, and all my energy in my house. We work out of a home office. It's amazing. So that would be one thing. He wanted to see a lot more heat pumps and electrified homes, electrified transportation. So bring back the zero emission vehicle rebate. I think it was
Right.
5,000 at the federal level, and then it would be added onto at the provincial level. Here in British Columbia, we get about 3,000. So it's an $8,000 incentive. And he wants big polluters pay Canadians to make their green choices. So he's going to take some or all of the revenue that is collected under the industrial emitters tax and rebate it to Canadians or to support the programs that they put in place as incentives. Now, the problem here is that on the industrial emitters side, on both sides actually, but there's an equivalency agreement. So the federal government and the provincial government sit down at the table and they agree on the design of the carbon tax at the provincial level. And even
Right.
Alberta has an equivalency agreement. In fact, they just doubled the stringency of it here a couple of years ago.
Right.
So what that means is that a premier or Prime Minister Carney would have to get the provinces on side in order for this to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not clear to me. Like in Alberta, for example, they have the Emissions Reduction Alberta program, which is set up expressly to recycle the industrial carbon tax into projects. So they support companies that want to, reduce their emissions in a big way, or they support research, they support early stage technologies, all sorts of stuff. So is Alberta going to say, no, no, we'll keep emission reduction, Alberta, thank you very much. You go figure out how to pay for your programs. Anyway, my point here is that's not going to be, it may sound great on Mark Carney's website, but I can foresee a lot of problems in implementing his ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, now that gets us to Chrystia Freeland. And Chrystia Freeland was the finance minister up until a couple months ago. And then she
Right.
resigned, and now she's running for the leadership of the Liberal Party. She has no concrete suggestion. What she says is she'll work in collaboration with the provinces and the territories to design a program that works for everybody. Good luck. I mean, she's going to run into exactly the same kind of issues that Carney's going to run
Yes.
into in the implementation of his program.
Mhm.
So I don't know.
Mhm.
We'll see how that all plays out. But there's another way to do this. And this is really key. It's how China, for example, and to some extent, it's true in Europe. 15 years ago, China decided that it wanted to dominate clean energy manufacturing. So we're talking about solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries, heat pumps, all of that. And the government poured huge amounts of money into supporting companies who were making those technologies. And some of them were startups. And, like at one point, there were 700 electric vehicle startups in China. And
Wow.
up until recently, there were 100, which is still an enormous number of automakers.
Yes.
Now, a lot of them were real tiny and some of them were in niches, but the Chinese believe that they will eventually, when the smoke clears somewhere in the not too distant future, there'll be 12 to 15 Chinese automakers. So they create this, World Wrestling Federation kind of competition between all of the companies. And well, we see this, who's the strongest, who can survive.
Yeah.
And so they put all those, and then they put other programs in place to support the manufacturers. Then what they did is they put in place programs on the demand side to support consumers who want to buy these things. So there were things
Right.
like in many cities, you had to buy a license plate, and it was a lot easier to get a license plate for an electric vehicle than it was for a gas vehicle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So people just took the path of least resistance and went and got an electric vehicle. And then there
Yeah.
were subsidies. And then there was recently there was a cash for clunkers. Get the old cars off the road and get you to buy a new EV. And now the Chinese government has decided that solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles will be the three new things. This is what they call them in China. The focus of their industrial expansion over the next
Yeah.
immediate future. And so they want their electric vehicle manufacturers to dominate global manufacturing. So here's the thing. They supported the manufacturing of these products. Then they supported the demand, the consumption of those products. And they've become, in very short order, they have become a clean energy technology powerhouse. China just dominates
100%.
everything. The EU did something similar. Countries like Germany have had their own programs. The EU, after Russia invaded Ukraine, brought in the Repower EU to accelerate the spread of renewable electricity. So you and I talked about that a number of episodes ago.
Mhm.
And then the United States under Biden,
Yeah.
the U.S. Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, poured
Mhm.
hundreds of billions of dollars in. And so they did essentially, in principle, what the Chinese did. They've got EV
Yeah.
plants getting built. They've got battery plants getting built, solar panel manufacturing plants getting built because there's a strong demand in the domestic power grid for
Yeah.
solar panels. And then they put support on the demand side. So now you can get $7,500 tax credit towards an electric vehicle, for example. And then the states have programs, and that's industrial policy. You have a strategy,
Exactly.
and then you put in place those policies you need to support them. Yes, it's a little more expensive. That's
Well,
true.
maybe up front, but in the long run, is it going to be?
And is it going to be effective? China's
Right.
proven it can be effective. The
Yeah.
U.S. was up until until Trump was elected, was actually making good progress in a very short period of time. The
Yeah.
EU has been a bumpier road. They made some progress, and then they've had some difficulties in recent years with governments withdrawing, and it's not clear how that's all going to play out. Their economies
Yeah.
were really disrupted when Russia turned off the gas,
Yes. Yeah.
gas
Yeah.
to the EU.
Yeah.
So if I had to sum this up, it's if we're going to uh, get rid of the consumer carbon tax, and I think at this point it's lost its political legitimacy, it's got to go.
Yeah.
So we're
Has
going to
to.
replace it with something else. Why don't we sit back and say, what are other countries doing? Why
Yeah.
don't we take an industrial strategy approach so that some of our money, government money, goes into supporting Canadian manufacturers who are producing these vehicles? Now, we're a country of 40 million. We don't have a big enough domestic market to do what the Americans did or the Chinese did. I acknowledge that. So we would have to pick and choose which niches we would go into.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of natural resource work in Canada. Maybe it's light and heavy duty pickups,
Yeah.
designed to work in the cold, in severe cold in the winter. That kind of,
Yeah.
and then put in place demand to buy those until they can scale up and bring the cost down.
Yeah.
And that to me is a sensible way to approach this because you're
Yeah.
building industry and creating jobs at the same time as you're getting people to adopt new technology and bringing down your emissions. Focusing
Hmm.
and MC, we've had this conversation many times within the energy circle, and we will have it many times in the course of this show.
More.
It's industrial policy uh, is better than carbon price essentially squeezes emissions out of the old economy.
Yeah.
The industrial policy and strategy builds you a new economy. It
Yeah.
pivots
Pushes us
pivots
forward.
your economy to something that is more competitive and cleaner and it creates industry,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So what we need, Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland are on the right path.
Yeah.
Just think they're missing piece of the puzzle, a big piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
So and so as a consumer, what's your take on this? Because you and your husband, you bought an EV and you have a heat pump in your house, don't you?
We moved and we don't anymore, but we are going to put one in our new house. We also loved our heat pump and you know, definitely think it's the way to go.
Right. So in your previous home, and you had a heat pump, did you find that your electricity bills were quite reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, it made a big difference, and our house was so comfortable. I think for us, that's the big advantage too. Is like it's cool in the summer, it's hot in the winter, it's constantly the same temperature, and yeah, it's just so comfortable. It's not it's so easy for you don't have to worry about filling up an oil tank or and there's just no worry and it's very very reliable. So for us and my husband's a bit of a tech buff, so for him it's all about the technology. He likes to have everything extremely high tech.
I I I sympathize with him. I'm kind of that way myself. I'm a gadget guy. I'm a little gadget.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but the issue here, and we'll close the show with this, MC. The issue here is, are we going to keep calling this climate policy when
yeah,
when the carbon tax has already been discredited politically,
Yes.
and there's been a decline in support in the polling amongst Canadians for climate policy.
Yes.
And or are we going to call it something different? Where, like, I have to tell you, I like Carney's idea. He says, "Let's go build."
Yes.
Yes, let's go build clean energy manufacturing, uh, and their supply chains, and let's get on that because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Let's go build. I like that. So, are we going to do that, or are we just going to squeeze away here and there at you know, the industry and consumers and squeeze emissions out? I would like to see the bold approach.
Well, and I mean, everything that we talk about on the show points to we have to go that way. You know, if we're looking at peak oil demand, if we're looking at these things, they're happening sooner than we think. And so we need to act. We need to take bold action if we're going to be able to, make sure that we have jobs and we're part of this change going on, outside of our borders.
Uh, in the very near future, we're going to have an episode about the comparison between combustion technologies like internal combustion engine, gas furnaces for your home, those sorts of
Yeah.
things, and electric technologies. Because in my opinion, and I think, it's kind of come out in our talk about heat pumps and EVs, the electric technology is better technology. It may not be perfect yet because it's still fairly recent and there's refinement and more development to come. Prices are going to have to come down. But I think that's another thing is this is not just about subsidizing technology for the sake of lowering emissions. It is better technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the user end, once you have that technology, you're like, oh, this is better. My heat pump was better. Is It's a better technology. EVs are better. Um, so I think once you kind of go that way, you won't really ever want to go back.
I agree. Well, thank you very much, folks. Maybe we should end MC with giving people the email and text number. So we invite you to get hold of us.
Yeah, so you can email us at the Energy Show with an I um, at gmail.com, or you can send us a text at 587-330-5757. And yeah, comments, questions. It'd also be great if you could like and subscribe our channel on YouTube and hit that little bell if you want to get notifications whenever we post something new.
Great. Well, we'll see you tomorrow at MC, unless parental duties pull you away. Otherwise, I'll be flying solo. But until the next show.
Sounds good. Bye, everyone.